Welcome to another of Keystone's webinars. Today we're going to be talking about how to use the summer holidays to prevent learning loss, and are joined by two teachers, experienced teachers, to share their expert guidance on the topic. As with all of our webinars, the aim is for you, the audience, to listen in on a semi-structured conversation between myself and our panelists. This will continue for 25 to 30 minutes, after which time I will open up for questions from the floor. If you have any questions at any stage throughout, please do just pop them in the Q&A section, the function at the bottom of the Zoom window. And we, just so you're aware, have a hard stop at 3. And I know that Olly, one of our panelists, needs to go and teach a lesson. And so we'll need to leave it at sort of 2:50. But we hopefully will have plenty of time for questions. I'm delighted to be joined by two experienced teachers, Olly Hopwood and Jonny Timms. Olly is currently head of German at Westminster School and is an assistant housemaster. He teaches German, French and Arabic, and prior to joining Westminster, taught in comprehensives for 10 years. Jonny is senior deputy head at Caldicott Prep School and is due to start as headmaster at Wolverhampton Prep School in September. Prior to joining Caldicott, Jonny was a housemaster at Merchiston, so has experience of both senior and junior schools as well. So I think we're pretty well set to cover hopefully the full range of students with regards to our title today. Before I kind of crack on with the questions, I just thought I'd sort of define learning loss, just in case those of you were unsure of how we were framing it. Summer learning loss, or it's often called the summer slide, is an educational term that's used to describe where students lose some knowledge, skills, and ability that they may have acquired over the school year, over that summer holiday period, which can be between 6 and 8 weeks long. So today, hopefully, we're going to kind of talk about that and maybe also give you lots of tips and tricks as to how you might prevent this occurring within your own children. Great. Jonny, if I can come to you first of all, the research suggests that summer learning loss is more significant in primary age children, particularly those under 10. Have you experienced this given your role and your time within the prep sector? And if so, to what extent?
Thanks, Ed, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. We were talking just before we came on about the fact that learning loss it can be quite controversial. So there's a few things that I say first, if that's okay, that I think are important to say, because I think in thinking about learning loss, it assumes that learning is linear. It's not. It's messy, and that's the joy of learning. And then the second thing I just want to say to start is that I think we have to be quite careful about the message that our kids might get from this, and I don't think necessarily that they should be thinking, am I making progress from term to term? Am I making progress over the summer? I want them to feel confident, yeah, of course, and to be able to ask questions to advance their learning. Or to fill a gap or untie a knot, but we don't want them. But don't we want them to be learning because they're interested, because they're motivated? And for me, so I just think I just want to be wary of any constant need for checking against standards or expectations.
That's fair enough.
They can lead to comparisons, which I don't think are helpful. To answer your question, I think that. Some studies do show that kids under 10 lose on average, 2 to 3 months of academic skill over the summer. And that's practically 25% of learning in the school year, which is worrisome. In my experience, I have seen it, I have felt it, probably more so in the States. So I've taught in an inner city state school at secondary level, at senior school, and then at prep school level. I'd say that I felt it most at the state school that I taught at, and to lesser of an extent at the senior school and the prep school. I think it's an issue of age. I think that the younger are more prone to it. We can maybe talk about why that might be.
Yeah, I was going to say, why do you think that might be?
I think they're largely at a crucial stage of their development. If you think about a child's trajectory I've got a 2.5-year-old son, and his language acquisition at the moment is quite staggering. And but as he gets older, that trajectory plateaus somewhat. And so thinking about it in that way, I think it therefore makes sense that the extent to which the loss happens. So the younger they are, decoding letter knowledge and so on, they're more susceptible to decay without frequent practice. But I think that something that we may come on to is this issue of not just age but also inequality. And Olly will have something to say about this, I'm sure, but I think that's even more obvious in the current circumstances with remote learning that we find ourselves in.
Thanks very much, Jonny. Olly, if you want to come in, I guess the idea here is we're sort of pitting you sort of as one sort of more senior school focused and the other more kind of prep school focused, so that we're covering all bases. Have you experienced learning loss with students sort of 13 to 18, so Westminster age? What are your thoughts on it?
Absolutely. I suppose I tend not to have used or to use that particular term in a way which faces students in particular, but I think most secondary teachers would identify with this sense of students in September being a bit rusty, perhaps having lost some of the finer detail of what they might have learned, and a sense of excitement, also with an apprehension and sometimes a bit of disorientation when students arrive in the classroom again in September after what is a long break. I definitely agree with Jonny's observations that it does seem to be more acute with the younger learners. So the transition from year 7 to year 8, year 8 to year 9, and to some extent year 9 to year 10 feels more disruptive in terms of that kind of imagined linearity of knowledge and skill acquisition than it does, for example, in Key Stage 5 for the sixth formers. And I suspect that's to do with the fact that as students get older, particularly those students in the higher attaining kind of tranches of the cohort, will actually be using their summer holidays, thinking about their aspirations for universities, for example, thinking about their A-level courses. So even if they're not actively working, their minds are perhaps visiting their learning in a way which you wouldn't expect a primary age student to do. I think, though, when we talk about summer learning loss, we can also think about some of the other changes which students show us that they go through over the summer holidays. And I think at secondary, we also notice and appreciate the ways in which students come back in September, sometimes having forgotten quite a lot of things, but also having grown quite a lot as individuals, and often coming in September of the next year with a wholly more mature and different outlook on their learning. And it's really quite exciting to see that in September. It's one of the things that I looked forward to when going back to school towards the end of August, beginning of September, is actually students come to the classroom with a new sense of self, and that's all about how they're growing up and shaping their ideas and shaping their ambitions and plans. I also think at secondary level, where we have more subject specialists than at primary, that different subjects will experience that summer rupture in different ways. And I think it's definitely more visible in those subjects with a more expressly cumulative knowledge trajectory. So in subjects, for example, like my own in modern languages, but I also think in mathematics is probably the case, more so than in those topics, in those subjects, which are perhaps more topic based or thematic based. So for example, in a year 10 history class starting in September, you wouldn't necessarily be looking for them to remember what they'd learned at the end of year 9, because you might be covering quite different topics and quite different areas of knowledge. What you might really be looking for is for them to have remembered those skills, those analytical skills, those writing skills, and be able to deploy those quickly. So I think it does, it varies from subject to subject, and I think it's something that some subjects probably have to plan for more than others. I think the phrase learning loss, though, as you were saying, Jonny, is really, really interesting, because I think particularly in subjects like languages and mathematics, we almost have to predict it. We have to plan for it. It's a really natural part of learning, and that's I'm sure will come out in the discussion that follows.
No, you're very kind, Olly, because you're winging us into my next question,
Okay.
which is, I guess, given that we accept that it can occur, and perhaps the term is unhelpful because it suggests a much more problematic issue than maybe actually it can be in certain scenarios. Obviously, we all acknowledge that it can be really significant for some. But given that we acknowledge it's there, is there anything? To what extent can schools do anything about this can mitigate this, either prior to or post the summer holidays? So I wonder, just given that you've alluded to a little bit of that, Olly, could we start with you and then come to you, Jonny, afterwards?
Yeah, and I think it's actually that's really the core purpose that sits behind our end of year exams, for example, or end of year assessments in years 7, 8, 9, and 10. They're obviously presented to students sometimes as summative assessments of what students are learning. Really, for us, they're as much formative as they are summative. And the idea of those assessments that we do in June or July is to give students an opportunity to revisit their learning. What we know is that, and it might be helpful for anybody watching or listening to have a picture of Ebbinghaus's forgetting curve. Perhaps someone could just mention that in the chat. I think late 1800s, and it really is a really visual representation of the way that when we learn things, we quite quickly forget them, and it's entirely normal to forget them. But that each time that we relearn them, we remember a slightly larger proportion of the content. So as teachers, we're always looking for ways in which we can confront students with opportunities to try and retrieve and recall their knowledge. And doing assessments, particularly towards the end of the year, is a really important way in which we give students an opportunity to look backwards over their learning, to reassemble it in their minds, to have a go at applying it and demonstrating it at the end of year, end of the summer term. And also it gives us the opportunity, the platform, to do some kind of revision lessons and some skills support as they do so. So I think that's bookending the school year in that way is really helpful to maximise the amount of long-term learning that can take place. And ditto, we plan for that when students come back in September. Often in September, you'll find at secondary level teachers doing low stakes quizzes, low stakes tests to see what students have remembered and see what they can still do without the kind of threat of having to do resits or without the threat of having to revise for it. It's really just an opportunity for them to delve back into their memories. And we also plan our schemes of learning and our topics, for example, and the units of work that we go through, bearing in mind in September that we might need to revisit some certain things and cover certain things at different times of the year, depending on where
Sure.
students are in that, as Jonny said, rightly messy and sometimes circular experience that learning is.
Indeed. Jonny, I'm not necessarily suggesting that it's totally different at prep level, but are there anything that you do as a school to consider this issue? Both, I mean, obviously you will have end of year examinations, I'm sure, even at the younger age, and obviously, I'm sure you use loads. No.
But I would echo exactly what Olly said. I scribbled down just while I was talking. I'd scribbled down the word confidence. I think that's really, really key, and particularly at prep stage. And we're particularly mindful at the moment of transitioning and how that's going to look, given the challenges that we're facing at the moment, and how important that that transfer of information is going to be. I think that in thinking about mitigating it, one thing I like to do is think about how we're affecting the positive neuroenergy of our children. How are we doing that? How are we changing the chemistry in their minds when they discover something that they just love, that really captures their imagination? Research says that 90% of the ideal learning state is called flow. Or Ed, I know you're really into being in the zone. So how do we get our children to that place? How do we get them in that state? Because we know that the physical chemistry and structure of a child's brain changes when they're full of hope. And I think that it's worth us really thinking, as teachers, as parents, how we can get our children into that place. So I think as for schools, it's thinking about how we can tee up experiences and opportunities for that. So for experiential learning, because experience is what we care about, that, you know, if we feel it, we're more likely to benefit from it. So at Caldicott, one thing that we look at is some project-based learning that tries to tap into that. Summer reading challenges that you know, that try to set an expectation and capture the imagination of the boys and the parents too. And so, you know, they're getting excited about sharing their story and their narrative around the journey that they're on and that they've been on. One example of this, and I shared it with your colleague Sarah before Ed, was the STEAM project that we do at Caldicott. So STEAM, for those that don't know, is science, technology, engineering, art, and maths. And that's a project that the children are set at the start of the summer, and the idea is that they research, they plan, they innovate, they make something, they test it, they experiment, and then they evaluate it and refine it. And I think there's an example of that that's been posted in the chat there. But it's really asking them to be a game changer, you know, trying to tap into what really drives them and how they're going to make a difference to the world and use all those skills that we've just been talking about. It's not just a science experiment. It's more than just making something. So it's really just trying to get them excited and get their brains working. That's
really great. Now, context is so key, isn't it? You've got to kind of buy it. It can't just be sort of bitty. They've got to see they've got to situate learning in a broader context. And if they can really connect with it, the results are so much better. I guess you both very helpfully kind of discussed little bits about how schools try to manage learning loss, or certainly the kind of the gap, shall we call it, rather, in the learning between the end of the summer term and the beginning of the winter term, the autumn term. But I just wonder, obviously, a lot of parents listening will be concerned about what it is they can do to sort of combat this. A lot of parents just generally in conversation are concerned about the length of summer holidays and how can they keep minds active, etc. Are there things that you would recommend, Jonny, that are better than others? I mean, obviously, I know you've talked about your project, but from a parental point of view, if perhaps your child is not at a school like Caldicott where they're setting things like this, are there things that you'd recommend parents could do easily within the context of a summer holiday, particularly primary age students?
Yeah, it's probably worth being clear to start with. I guess split them out into two buckets. So you've got the school assigned work, and then you've got the kind of the learning beyond the syllabus or whatever it might be. And as you say, some depending on age as well, at Caldicott we might not even set school assigned work. So I should have sort of said to start with, read, and I can't emphasize that enough. And you know, we can talk about that more as well, about how we can do that in creative ways into that if you like. But one of the things that I think is important for us all to remember is not just to do everything for your child. One of the things, my takeaways from remote learning is to it's been interesting seeing the children sit with their discomfort a little bit and not rush for help, struggling with it a little bit longer. Mm-hmm. And trying to persevere and try something different and try something better. There's a clip that I quite like from Little Britain a few years ago with two characters that called Andy and Lou, and one of those is a carer for the other who's in a wheelchair, and it's a very attentive carer attending to this guy's every need. But whenever the carer's back is turned, the camera would show Andy jump out of his wheelchair and do something quite extraordinary, from wrestling a lion to pole vaulting. And of course, the point is that you know, sometimes it's all too easy for us to step in the moment our children are struggling, and I do that as a teacher as well as a parent, because actually, you know, they don't need that, and it's not the right thing for us to do, and they're doing all sorts anyway, from coding to improvising on their guitar or whatever it is, and that's learning. So it's about letting them work things out for themselves. The other thing I would say is allowing them to take some risks. I think is all good, and it may seem strange saying this in the middle of a global pandemic, but I do worry about our lives becoming slightly too sanitized. We need to be better at exposing our children to genuine risk. And
how do you do that? What does that look like? So in the context of a summer holiday, if I'm a parent and I'm needing to, I'm buying into what you're suggesting, what could I do where I would expose my child? I understand the benefit of that, of potentially them risk getting more confident, being able to be more independent, all of those sorts of skills, but how might I do that? Can you give an example of a context for that?
So can you throw them out into the garden and get them to build a shelter and stay there for a night, for 2 nights, to give them a budget to buy themselves food that they can cook on a campfire and see how they get on? And that's not too cavalier, but I think it's exposing them to a certain amount of risk. It is showing them that they can do more than they thought maybe was possible before. And it's exciting, and they might come knocking at the door at 11 o'clock at night when it's throwing it down with the rain, as it has been this afternoon. But that's I think that's all to the good, and they're going to be learning from that.
So essentially, just sort of independent activities where they take almost complete control of what it is they're doing around a set of parameters which a parent may have laid out. So it could be anything, but ultimately where they're taking almost 100% control of what they're doing.
Yeah, I think so. And maybe that wasn't a great example. Maybe I'll keep thinking of examples, because I think it's important that I back that up with another one. There's one more thing that I was going to say, if I may, and that's just about civic responsibility, which I think is pretty key right now. And so looking for opportunities for them to be able to do that and volunteer and help in their community. And kind of linked to that is pupil voice. I think it's important it's important to me. I think it'll be important to the future of education as well. And they need to realise that they have a voice, and that voice is powerful and loud, and they can be a little bit too, and particularly, Ollie, I would imagine that you see this even more in the teenage years, but they can be a bit passive. They need to realise that they have a voice, and that voice is powerful and loud, and that they have a responsibility to do something with that voice. So can they tweet in reply to Donald Trump? Can they write a letter to the Times? I think parents and teachers should be exhorting them to be more vocal, to engage with issues. And I think that's something else that they could maybe think about for the summer.
Thanks very much, Jonny. Ollie, we've had a few suggestions of independent activities, tasks, camping in the garden, writing to Donald Trump. What would you, does it differ at all with senior school students? What kind of activities? I guess parents are going to find sort of recommendations of tasks, these sort of things, as Jonny has listed, really helpful, no doubt.
Sure, and actually, as you were talking about risk there, I was just jotting down some ideas about what that means, perhaps for the secondary student. And I think you make a really, really valuable point there, Jonny, that the summer holidays are a time when secondary students can start experimenting with what it means to be a grown-up without the social and academic pressure of it being in a classroom. So they can, if they can read something or watch something or write something that they perhaps wouldn't do as part of their curriculum, and it might be quite difficult for them. Actually, they might be in year 7 or year 8 and try reading a book which is really quite difficult, for example, but it's okay, because if it's in their own time, they're not going to be judged on how they've read it, they're not going to be judged on how they've understood it. It's doing something in their own realm and off their own steam, which is really positive, and giving students the opportunity to recognize a summer holiday as kind of stress-free learning might be really good. I think my most important strategy would actually to be for parents to kind of embrace that potential for learning loss. And I do think students in all sorts of schools work very, very hard and face all sorts of pressures when they're grown up in their teenage years, particularly. A secondary school is quite a tough place to be. There's a lot going on. There are huge expectations upon you from the system and often from home as well. And the students really need and benefit from a little bit of a different rhythm of life over the summer. And I think it uniquely applies to the summer holiday rather than the Christmas and Easter holidays. So finding ways to keep the mind nourished without it being necessarily designed to stop a little bit of seepage of learning is a really good thing. And I'd echo what Jonny says about reading. Reading's always good. There is never a student can never read too much, and that's really good food for the mind. I think another key thing that parents can do is talk to their students, talk to their children about their learning, and ask them to revisit in conversation with the family what it is they've really enjoyed, what it is they found challenging, how they found different subjects, different styles of teaching, and just encourage them to keep thinking about their learning without necessarily putting them into panic mode that they might have forgotten bits of it. It's okay that they will have forgotten bits. That's absolutely normal and absolutely fine. And we're kind of all over it as teachers. They don't need to worry about that. But starting to identify with the child some of those things which actually do excite them a little bit, and that will sometimes come across in very reserved terms in the teenage years, because as you say, Jonny, teenagers aren't always effusive and chatty about the things which they're passionate about. And just gently nurturing those and encouraging open conversation about them will really, I think it's those kind of conversations that whose fruits we see as teachers when the child comes back in September. They might have forgotten X% of what they learned last year, but they come with Y% more enthusiasm and engagement and commitment to the subject, just because of something they experienced over the summer. That might have been something they read, something they watched on telly, an argument they had with their brothers and sisters, something they experienced when they were traveling or visiting relatives. It can be the most unexpected of things, which just sparks off a little bit of inspiration in their mind. So I suppose maximizing opportunities to talk about learning, to talk about things that might be interesting for the child is really what counts, possibly even more so than doing any sort of catch up on things they might be forgetting.
And would you classify things like, I mean, Jonny talked about civic responsibility. Would you classify things like work experience? Because when you're slightly older, and I'm not saying that there aren't children at prep level, Jonny, and do let me know if there are doing work experience, but often it's more common within the senior school age bracket. Would that classify as sort of helping to stave off learning loss potentially?
Yeah, absolutely. I think in some senses, and I'm biased when I say this, but being actively involved in community life and volunteering is possibly even more meaningful. I know students, rarely do students speak really, really highly of work experience they do in year 10, but they often speak really highly of volunteering they might do as part of their Duke of Edinburgh programs, or Duke of Edinburgh expeditions, that kind of thing, over the summer breaks and over weekends. So if I was time poor in the summer holiday, I would always encourage community activities and volunteering and civic engagement. And I think the quality of learning that takes place in those kind of endeavours is extremely high, really, really high. And it's often my experience of it is that it's often very much character building for students, and they really wear those experiences on their sleeves when they start to encounter kind of more grown-up issues in Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 in the curriculum. Sure.
Thank you for that. Yeah, go for it, Jonny.
Yeah, you're asking about work experience, and I just think one of the interesting things about remote learning over the last few weeks has been, parents' engagement has been phenomenal, and it's been really interesting seeing the fusion of the classroom and the workplace. And for a while now, as educators, we've been bombarded with cliches about the jobs landscape and the skills that our young people need, and yet education has been slow to respond to that. And so we've had an opportunity over the last few weeks to really look at how our learning makes sense in context, and with parents trying to do their own job whilst also supporting their children with home learning. So I think there's something in that, and that conversation maybe needs to be escalated somehow, but I am interested in that, and I think there's something there that maybe could be explored further.
Great. Well, before we kind of talk about, because I think you both alluded to this notion of balance, the sense that, yes, it is productive and useful to nourish the brain over that period of time, but you need to balance that, because obviously I'm assuming children at your schools are having very busy school years, and holidays are holidays for a reason. But before we kind of go into those points, if anyone has any questions, please do pop them in the chat, and then we'll look to come to them ASAP. We're going to break up for questions in just a minute, so if you do have some questions, please do pop them in the chat, and we'll come to them. I can see a couple there already, but we will respond to those shortly. This notion of balance, Jonny, and making sure that we're keeping brains active, but we're allowing the summer holiday to be summer and enjoyable, etc. Do you have any thoughts about how parents might strike the right balance there?
Yeah, I think that it's really important. Balance is a pretty boring word, isn't it? But it's going to be so important, and we're seeing in staff and children, we're beginning to see burnout. So it's really important. I think having the right mindset is going to be key, and Olly talked about the dialogical approach that parents and children might have, and how important that is. As teachers, we talk a lot about questioning, so parents might think about that a little bit more, because we know that the depth of thinking revolves around the quality of the questions that we ask. And I'd also encourage parents to really think about the language that they're using. So moving, particularly at prep age, if you can move from the indicative to the subjunctive, so if you can talk about what could be as opposed to what is, and just build in possibility into the conversations that you're having, so they're beginning to thinking about thinking a little bit more. And then one other thought I had was thunks. I don't know if you've come across Ian Gilbert. Maybe Sarah, you could put a link in there, but he comes up with thunks, which he describes as kind of thought hand grenades, which are brilliant if you've got long journeys or whatever, if you're taking a train or whatever, or in the car for some time over the summer. And it's all about the fact that there's no wrong answers, and that's the starting point. It's not guessing the idea in your parent's head, but it's questions such as, is a broken down car parked? Can you wash a hole? Is it okay to bully a bully? Those sorts of things. And I think that when they get more used to it, you can get some really sophisticated thinking and kind of discussions there. So questioning, and Ian Gilbert's thunks are really good. The other thing that I would recommend parents do is to read Said's Rebel Ideas. He's got some really good stuff in there. And he talks about assumption reversal, which is really fun, and that's all about creative thinking. So it's about taking the core notions of an idea and kind of turning them on their head. So he uses the example of Uber, the taxi company, and so the assumption being that taxi companies own cars, and so the reversal of that would be taxi companies own no cars. And so 20 years ago, that might have sounded ludicrous, but today, of course, the largest company, taxi company that's ever existed, doesn't own any cars. And so it's kind of disrupting things and being creative with that. And then there are some games that you can play around improvisation as well, which are quite fun, and getting them to stand up in the front of the room or whatever it might be, and just talk on a topic, any topic for 1 minute on whatever it might be. And of course we all would fail miserably, 2 seconds, but then they do it a second time, a third time, and actually they learn to improvise, they learn to blag, and it's a great skill to have, and it's fun too, and all the family can do that. So there's a few ideas there, and it's about having fun with it, I think.
Olly, anything to add there?
Yeah, the only thing I would add is I think with the secondary lens, inevitably students become more preoccupied with individual subjects, particularly I think in the British system if your child is studying a GCSE A level rather than something broader such as IB. And so they can their sense that their learning becomes more and more allied to individual academic disciplines than it becomes with the development of a sense of self, which I think is problematic in many ways, and that's why kind of the broader school life is just so important, rather than just what goes on in the classroom. That having been said, I think my main, if I were to offer one thought to parents of secondary age students, is that over the summer we really don't want or need or expect students to be ahead of the curriculum. That's, if a student says, I want to work over the summer holiday, shall I start looking at next year's work? I'll always say, no, we've got all of next year to do that. If you really want to invest in your learning, and I really encourage that, of course, it will be to go beyond, not ahead. So, and I think there is a difference between being ahead of the learning and allowing oneself to go beyond it. Going beyond it also is a great way of revisiting things. It's possible to forget some of the things that we've done and be making progress at the same time, precisely because of what Jonny was saying about learning not being linear. It's really messy. We start somewhere kind of down here, and we do get up here, but it's not via a line. So I'd be looking for those recommendations from individual subject teachers, particularly as you get towards Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5 in those subjects that your child's interested in, and finding those really off-the-wall books which are not about the curriculum. They're not covering next year's stuff. They're just nourishing that excitement and enthusiasm. So in my own subject, I recommend a really fun book called Speak the History of Language. It's just all about how rich and amazing and fantastic languages are. That's way more valuable than them getting ahead with learning the Konjunktivzwei in German, which we do in Year 11. I'd much rather they did that and invested in their overall kind of engagement in learning and the subject rather than specifics.
Whilst I totally acknowledge that, and as a former teacher myself, and obviously in my current role, would definitely extol the virtues of that, the idea of beyond rather than ahead. I guess in the context of this summer, though, thinking about the students that you have that are in Year 10 and Year 12, obviously a part of Year 10 and Year 12, which is sort of one half of the A-level or IB or GCSE courses, have been disrupted, shall we say. Do you feel that this summer there needs to be greater focus and attention on making up for that period of time? I mean, obviously I appreciate that you may feel at Westminster you've delivered exactly the curriculum you wanted to, irrespective of it being online, but I guess there won't be others that are in an unfortunate position potentially.
It's a very, very important question, Ed, if I may. Inevitably, even in schools where that have been able to revert to an online timetable overnight, that doesn't mean the same learning will have been able to take place. I don't think any school across the world would be able to say that. It's been different, and in many ways, it won't have been for some students as good. And that's reality, and schools have done the best they can across the land in the context that they have to do as much as they possibly can. And actually some students may have benefited from it, we don't know yet. But it does raise the issue that some of those kind of core principles of how we shape the academic year, which I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, aren't there in the same way. We haven't had those lessons in the same way over the spring and the summer. Any end of year kind of rituals that we normally have will have been disrupted in some way, and coming back to school will also be disrupted. So there's kind of two bookend points in the school year sort of crumble at the edges this time, and that does mean that certainly as teachers we are planning differently for September, and it presents its challenges for us. So I do think this summer is a unique summer, and I hope we don't have another one like it. And does that mean that students would be well advised to do a bit more kind of directed learning over the summer than they otherwise would? On the one hand, absolutely, I can see the logic for that. On the other hand, I suspect they're feeling even more knackered than they normally would because of the emotional strain that this has put on all of us, and because those who have been able to access learning will have been doing so in a way which is very solitary and facing a screen, and so there will be a lot of, and I certainly, you know, I think Jonny referred to it before, we do sense exhaustion among both colleagues and students.
That's yeah, really thoughtful stuff, that, Ollie. Thank you, Jonny. Unless you have anything else to kind of add, I mean, I can see that some of our panelists, sorry, some of our audience members have already interacted with they like the idea of a barbecue budget, so the idea of giving students more sort of responsibility and independence, so that lots of really helpful things in the link that we've shared. I wonder if we could just start to kind of approach some of the questions, if I may. I'm conscious of time also, because I know, Ollie, you've got to go and teach.
I'm fine, actually. I've managed to get covered for those 10 minutes.
Okay,
so
great. I just wanted to start. So, Ollie, I'll probably fire this question at you because it's to do with the 11 plus. Is there any advice you can? Sorry, Jonny, I'm going to fire it to you. Is there any advice you can give for our children taking the 11 plus? How much summer homework to do, if any? So I guess they're assuming that they're talking probably about 11 plus potentially in January 2021. So, Jonny, what are your thoughts on that?
I don't think my advice changes. I'd be reticent to say how much. I think it depends a little bit on the starting point and the needs of your son or daughter. So I think it's kind of sitting down with them, working with them to kind of work out a schedule that's going to work, and you know, what do you want to achieve from the summer, and then kind of working back from that.
So kind of sort of setting out goals for this period, and then working to them. Is that how might you determine what those goals would or could be? Would you recommend parents come and talk to you, you know, in school and say, look, you know, want to do some work over the summer period? What do you think about this? Or might there be another way in which they'd be able to determine what these goals might or could look like?
Yeah, fair question. Yeah, I think a dialogue with the school is probably really important, and if they haven't already had, you know, a good idea from the last few weeks where some deficiencies might be, and what areas particularly to focus on, then I think, yeah, reaching out to the school and thinking about making a plan and setting some clear topics and areas to really drill down on would be helpful. Yeah, and a roadmap for the summer is also pretty helpful. Yeah, there's probably best not to wait till mid-August and then scramble around, because that's not going to end well.
Okay, there's a slight addition to this question. It seems like the same question has been asked, but in a slightly different ways. I mean, I guess there's a notion that this idea, this balance of too much, too little, and avoiding burnout. This is particularly with regards to a year 5 student. Again, I'm preparing for a January 11 plus. I mean, does this talk to what Ollie was discussing about children being exhausted by the end of this term, particularly so, and therefore slightly more tread more carefully over the summer period? Would that be your advice, Jonny, in relation?
I think so. I don't think our Prime Minister was particularly helpful when he threw us the curveball by talking about the great summer catch-up in some ways. I think it was well intended, but I also think there's something that has to come before all that. Before we think about bridging any academic gaps, I think that, you know, it's going to be a really vulnerable time. However, you know, some, yes, have picked up and really flown, but I also think that we just have to be really careful and listen really closely and carefully to what our children are saying. You know, they are remarkably resilient, yeah, but I think sometimes we you know, expect them to have a strength of spirit beyond their years, and so we won't have been able to shield them from the news, from, you know, the many deaths and all the rest of it. So it's a vulnerable time, and so yes, they'll in years to come they'll be asking what opportunities we made of it as teachers, as parents, but they'll also be asking about how we gave them, how we helped them find their voice. We really need to listen, I think, is my key message.
Just one thing I guess I would add to an 11 plus parent, obviously coming from our angle, I think if your school isn't providing you with lots of helpful guidance, which could be the case, obviously ask, I think, is the first point. But I think secondly, if you are aiming towards a set of examinations, whatever they might be, if you could get hold of a paper or something like that, and you could do it with your child or get them to do it, then you could start to identify yourselves as a group, as a team. Okay, well, look, these are areas where you've done really well, or these are areas where you might be struggling a little bit, or you can go back to school reports. Summer reports also very useful at identifying areas where potentially children could focus. But I guess for the point we're saying is balance. That can't be the entirety of the summer holiday. And indeed, there are other learning experiences that Olly and Jonny have kindly shared that would be as nourishing academically as well. So ensures that when they get back in September, they hit the ground running. Olly, I'm going to come to you. Year 12, there's someone who's saying, over this period, that they're looking at preparations for the MAT, so the mathematics admissions test, also interview practice. I guess, I'm not sure what the question quite is, but I'm assuming that there are some year groups, particularly at the senior end, that have got probably predetermined summers in some ways, if they are thinking about applying for Oxbridge, for example, because they do need to get things done reasonably quickly and in time, so when they start in September, they're ahead of the curve. Could you maybe just give a little bit more colour to that?
Yes, absolutely. I think, so despite all the disruption that we've had to teaching and examinations, one thing which for now isn't changing is actually the UCAS process for 2021-22 intake. So those students in year 12 now, I think would be best advised to assume that everything will be as normal for them going into university, and it's certainly sensible to plan for exams being as normal next year. And there's no sign that there will be different deadlines for those Oxbridge applications, for example. And certainly every setting that I've ever worked in does always send those year 12s off for the summer holiday with some sort of academic project which feeds into their higher education progression plans. The key here, I think, is there was a period of time, and perhaps some of the parents in the webinar are from this age group, where UCAS was really about showing how many instruments you played and how many sports teams you're in and all the amazing extracurricular stuff you do. These days, UCAS is really interested in your academic credentials. Your personal statement should be about your passion for the subject. And the academic entrance tests, that things like the MAT, are really, really important. So I think slightly contradictory, in a way that's a little bit contradictory to what we've been saying. Those academic preparations for UCAS and entrance procedures will still be important in a way which is difficult for those students to manage, I think. The one thing I would bear in mind, though, is that particularly for year 13s, but actually for every school year group, the autumn term is the longest and the most tiring. It gets dark, it gets cold, there's Christmas, it's a long half term before the October half term, and it's a long one afterwards. And by the time we get to Christmas, students and teachers alike are kind of on their knees. And bear that in mind. The risk of burnout in autumn would be really damaging, actually, particularly for those in year 13, because it's precisely at the end of that autumn term that all those interviews take place and that UCAS deadlines tend to fall. So I know it sounds like I'm having my cake and eating it, but I am. Yes, the reality is in year 12, there always is some academic work that gets done in the summer for students applying for top ticket, top third universities, particularly Oxford and Cambridge and medicine. But it doesn't have to be a balance. And the trick is being smart in what you do. UCAS schools these days, in my experience, give sensible advice on what adds value and what doesn't. To those UCAS applications and to the things which take place over the summer to enrich that personal statement. Mm-hmm. So take that advice really seriously and don't be tempted to go too far. And it might be that this is the summer where things like that work experience in that law firm actually is going to be, especially if it's going to mean staring at a Zoom camera for 5 days, I would say let that drop.
Fair enough. That's yeah. I think your point, and both your points about reading is going to benefit somebody who's writing a personal statement in year 12 moving into year 13 as much as it's going to benefit somebody, you know, at the lower end of the curriculum who's perhaps thinking about 11 plus. It's, you know, there are going to be lots of opportunities, I guess, to read an array of things. Jonny, coming to you, this is right at the bottom end of the school age spectrum. My son is at reception now and will go into year 1 in September. Any advice about the summer holiday? So that's quite a big transition, isn't it, between reception and year 1? So I just wonder, any thoughts about, particularly for quite a young age, for summer holiday activity stimulation?
Yeah, I must confess to not being an expert at that age group and that transition. So I hesitate to give words of advice really, other than to reinforce this idea of reading and reading to them as well. I think that's such an important thing, and still one of the most effective things that we can do as parents. If they're fully independent, then time should be set aside for that. I think maybe there's a place for journaling too, and that's quite good if you're thinking about for them to be thinking about their transition as well, and their thoughts. And if they need scaffolding with that, there's a couple of good journals. So the Happy Self journal is a good one, which kind of helps them scaffold and structure their thoughts. Other than that, mindful of government guidelines, some play dates I think will be really helpful as well ahead of September.
Fantastic, thank you. I guess the next one is a question to both of you, because I imagine that both of you will have students joining your respective schools in September. And they'd be starting, both of your schools are academically pretty rigorous, and they might be moving to you from a school where there hasn't been much support, for example, or it may not have been, the pace of life may have been a little bit slower, perhaps. So I was wondering, could you both, I'll start with you, Olly, could you offer any sort of suggestion if you're starting your new school in September, whatever that might look like, and you're coming from a place of potentially the speed of learning isn't quite as quick, perhaps through lockdown they weren't provided with as much. What would you recommend to topping up core skills to ensure that when they come into school, that would work? And then I guess if I come to you afterwards, Jonny, just to think about people who might be joining at primary age, coming in maybe at year 5 or for 6, 7 and 8 or something like that. So yeah, Olly, do you have a thought about that?
Yeah, very interesting question. So what we wouldn't want to happen is that the student starting a new school is any student's going to be apprehensive. It's frightening actually to start a new school, and it's frightening enough as it is. What we don't want is for a student to carry any extra baggage with them when they start, because they've got all sorts of things to deal with when they arrive, making friends, working out how the place works, where everything is, who the teachers are, what the rules are, all those sorts of things. So we don't want to jeopardize the child's ability to be able to settle in well by introducing an anxiety that they've come from a background which prepares them less well than the others in the class. So preserving the child and nourishing the child's confidence and excitement about starting school feels the most important. And if they're going to an academically rigorous school, then be trusting of the school's ability to work with the child from the point of departure when they arrive in September is I think my most important message. We do all sorts of planning for our new intake at age 13 and age 16 at Westminster, and 98% of it is pastoral. It's really that onboarding process and giving students a positive start is very, very, very important to us. Beyond that, I think the sensible things to do are the things we've said earlier in the conversation about good, healthy dialogue, reading, exposure to interesting stuff, interesting conversation, to high quality language in the way that the parents, I'm sure, normally would.
Thank you. Jonny, thoughts with regards to kind of somebody coming into at primary age, so potentially coming maybe from a state primary into a prep school, something like that. Any thoughts from you and with regards to that? I think one of the questions is particularly about tutoring potentially, which I appreciate on the webinar of a tutoring company, but and independent workbooks. Are there things that perhaps you could buy from WH Smith's or that might in any way help or support?
Yeah, I think it's trying all of those things and being and seeing what works, and just keeping that dialogue going with your son or daughter. I'll yeah, tutoring too within that, I think is really valuable, and I think that is a good option in terms of taking the onus off the parent. If that is an issue, and you know, you are getting some pushback, then let the tutor do that. I think that can be helpful. A helpful strategy. I would massively echo what Ollie said about, you know, what we don't want is anyone feeling like they're an academic imposter when they arrive, and you know, so it's about nurturing confidence. I think that's really key. So yeah, trying a multitude of things, seeing what works, and then kind of rolling that out. I don't want to tread on your toes talking about tutoring, but I think there is a place for it. Maybe you could say more, you'll know more than me about how to schedule that, but it's, I often feel that doing it, those you know, those boys that from personal experience, and only anecdotal, but those boys in my experience that have had a tutor, you know, once a week over the summer, in my experience is and it's limited, is less effective than having a more intense, perhaps protracted series of sessions, rather than kind of a weekly thing. But you'll know more than me on that.
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. I think bursts versus kind of regular tuition. Obviously, there's a big gap between regular tuition if you're doing it once a week, you know, and as there are in our lessons. But certainly we wouldn't advocate over tutoring during that period, because I think it's you know, I think it's a holiday. You guys as schools design holidays for a reason, and I think it's important that the children have the rest. But going back to the comments that Ollie's made, there are certain year groups which unfortunately will have to, if they have aspirations for top universities or certain aspects, you know, may have to do a little bit more. And it may be the case that you could be very well supported by your parents if they choose to do that. You may be very independent and be able to do it on your own, but equally a tutor, the role of a tutor may be something that that could be beneficial for you. And I think we would always advocate try, and obviously if it doesn't work, then you should feed back to that tutor, you know, because I think there's no point in sort of slogging through it with little or no benefit. So yeah, it's an interesting one though in terms of the benefits between bursts versus, I think that often perhaps maybe that burst, some parents do think that having a burst at the end of August just to get you back up and running and thinking a little bit ahead of time can be useful. So yeah, I think that's an interesting observation. Just a couple of things I wanted to just quickly before we stop. Another question: executive functioning, parents giving the children and teenagers roles that build on these areas, so that the arrival at their school or their new school, they're better able to organise their new lives. I mean, I'm assuming you both would agree with this. Are there any kind of, can you expand on this at all? Ollie, perhaps, maybe?
Yeah, I know that students find it very helpful when we, so on the executive functioning, students need help organising their lives and their work, because it's not something that comes naturally to them. And so ways in which we can structure that both at home and at school and talk the same language is really helpful. And that can be as simple as, can you show me where your books are for X subject, or how do you organise your work in Y subject? It's because they're articulating questions for which the students haven't necessarily thought about answers, and it just prompts them to make positive, independent decisions about how they're going to organise their work and organise their time. I think that's a very, very valuable role for schools to play pastorally and for parents to play.
I just wonder if I get a comment from both of you. It's a really nice sort of perhaps closer in the chat. There's a comment here that says it's just hard to know whether remote learning over lockdown has set learning back or even perhaps moved it forward at a greater rate. And I'm assuming you're going to say it's context dependent, it's child dependent. But I just wonder what would, I guess when probably, so I've just seen a bit of an addition to this, remote learning meaning kind of 0 live lessons. What are your thoughts about that as a statement? Just to close. Jonny, perhaps? I
was hoping you were going to get to Ollie, so I had to reflect on that. I think there are two key factors. I think that parent involvement, there's no doubt that has been a big factor. And then the quality of the remote learning. If they haven't been live sessions, which to all intents and purposes, if they've been set homework or prep to kind of crack on and get away with, then yeah, there's been very, I can only imagine there's been very little feedback, and so that's tricky, and so you're groping in the dark a little bit. So yeah, that's tricky to know.
Fair enough. Ollie?
I think as teachers, we have to be endless optimists, but realists at the same time. That's a kind of necessary condition of classroom practice. So the realist in me says, bluntly, less learning will have taken place across the country as normally would have done. And that's a massive challenge for the whole of the education sector. And we have to be really creative next year in how we manage that, and now and over the summer. There's no doubt about it. So that's the realism side of it. The optimistic side of it is that we have to have belief in our students, in ourselves, in our institutions, and in opportunities that come out of this. And I do think actually that we have all had to think as teachers about how to get maximum value out of our time with our students, what's really, really important to us, what students can do if we allow them the space to do it. And that reminds me, Jonny, of some of the ideas and suggestions that you gave earlier in the seminar. And you know, the best thing about being a teacher is it never is the same. So I'm looking forward, and I'm sure colleagues across schools and across the country are looking forward to having had this experience, to think about how we can teach differently next year. And so it's one hell of a challenge when there's been no live lessons and learning's been disrupted in that way. But we have to be optimistic, and I think good things will come of it in some ways.
Great. Well, look, thank you so much both for your time. I know you've got to go meet parents, teach lessons, etc. It's been a real honour to have you here and just to share your thoughts and experiences. And thank you everyone else for attending. We'll leave you be. So thanks very much, both of you. Very kind.
Thanks,
Take care. Bye-bye.
Cheers, Ollie.